Okay, so let's get going. So modeling sequential data. We're going to talk about large language models, which everyone abbreviates as LLMs. This usage comes from natural language processing. What I mean by that is LLMs aren't really about language, they're about sequences. So referring to them as language models is possibly not the best choice because it sort of obscures the really broad scientific use that these things have, which I hope to illustrate for you, when we scroll down a little bit. So this session, we're going to be talking about the basics of sequential data modeling and introduce a couple of key elements that are going to help set the table for Archit's lecture next week, in which he basically goes more deeply into the subject. So just to get things rolling here, I just want to illustrate what's called an LLM pipeline. And here what we're going to do, okay, well, in this first cell, we're going to just do a little bit of setup just to make sure that things look nice, and hopefully that and Corey is adding live some environment variables that will hopefully prevent everything from exploding, which would be bad. So executing the cell is going to do that setup, okay, and then there's this. The third cell is basically installs what this does. The transformers library is this library from the Hugging Face site, and what it does is it provides an API that allows you to download pre-trained models and easily set them up and do various fun and useful things with them. If that's already executed, then we can actually get on to the business at hand. And that is, here we're going to actually, in this cell, we're going to import from the transformer import pipeline, which is the main sort of easy to use interface to their pre-trained models. And then that first line basically just is a way of specifying a particular pre-trained model, which in this case is GPT-2, and configuring it for a certain task, and that task is text generation, and you're going to see in a moment what that means, okay? And the last thing we're going to do here is we're going to set a prompt, and the prompt is just like a ChatGPT prompt. It's I'm late because, and the task that we're going to set, the task for text generation is to complete that sentence, okay? So we execute the cell, and you can see Corey's already done so, and we get some pretty interesting results. I'm late because at the gym you can't do that many people's workouts. You take them to the gym, and then it cuts off because we told them we wanted a maximum length of 25 tokens. And late because they've been waiting so long for the new iPhone to arrive. That's good. And then a carriage return in the video above you. And you get the flavor for this. They seem pretty random. So let's try to see what happens if instead of doing 5 of them, we do just one, but maybe we extend this length and see whether the craziness continues. So if you would do the honors, please, Corey. Okay, this one is really weird. And these are going to be different every time we do it. So this one says, I'm late because I'm late, and that will be a while until we get back. Jasper, source. Jasper was one of 3 members of the United Nations police force assigned to investigate the killings of members of Alistair and Talia. Jasper accompanied Talia on a mission to destroy Alistair's base. Talia had been planning her escape into hiding, but had found that her mission to destroy it had been unsuccessful. And then evidently this model footnotes itself while investigating enough of this nonsense. So here's some salient features of these sentences. Each one is different from the previous one. I mean, I'm sure you noticed that. The sentences are kind of disjointed, and they sort of tend to ramble and wander and sort of lose the thread pretty quickly and go down weird rabbit holes. Although sometimes you see echoes later in the text of things that were alluded to earlier in the text. And the sentences almost or almost always end in mid-sentence. So what's going on here? What explains this behavior? Well, okay, so the answer to the first question, well, I didn't phrase it as a question, but the reason that each sentence is different from the previous one is that the text prediction for these large language models is what's called generative. And generative is AI language for randomly sampled from an appropriately learned distribution. Okay, the text prompt is basically seeds that distribution in a sense and the distribution is over possible completions of the sentence. So each sentence is going to be a random sample from that distribution, and that explains why they're all different. Okay, but why do they ramble like this? So the answer to that is that in the first place, you should know that LLMs take a sentence and they split it up into words or word fragments, depending to they choose a scheme for doing this. And each such unit is called a token, okay? Now, the way that the samples are drawn is one at a time, sequentially. So if you have, if you denote the kth token by the simple T sub k, which could be a word or a space or punctuation mark and so on, then what happens at the nth stage is in this notation, the probability that the nth token should be Tn is given by this probability distribution conditioned on the prompt, the first token, the second token, and so on, up to Tn minus 1, okay? And then at stage n plus 1, the whole thing happens all over, except that now the probability of the n plus 1 token is conditioned on the prompt and all the tokens through Tn. So, and I'm just as an aside, if you're unfamiliar with this probability notation, I mean, you've probably seen it, but you shouldn't feel bad if you haven't. What this notation simply means, the notation prob x simply means the probability of occurrence of an event x. And if you have an expression like prob x vertical bar y, that should be read as a probability of the occurrence of x given that y has been observed. And we call this a conditional probability. And the point is that, the probability of x happening by itself, just naked of any conditioning, can be different from what you would say about the probability of x if you know some additional information contained in y. Like if I ask you, what's the probability that it's nighttime now, and you don't know anything else, you might say it's about 50%. But if I tell you, what's the probability that it's nighttime, given that I've just looked out the window and it's dark, well, then it's probably, more like 99%. I mean, there might be an eclipse or something, but most likely the explanation is that it's night, okay? So that's what that notation means. So because the sampling is sequential in this way, what winds up happening is that at the nth stage, the value of the nth token is most strongly influenced or conditioned by the nth minus 1, n minus 2, and so on. So the 90th one is most strongly conditioned by the 89th, the 88th, and the 87th, more so than it is by the prompt or that by the first, second, or third token. And we would say in this case that the model's attention capacity is kind of limited, and that's not unexpected. This thing is not ChatGPT. It's a small pre-trained model. Okay, so that's why the sentence is so disjointed and why it wanders around like it's kind of brain dead. It sort of forgets what it started talking about and just goes around randomly. So the answer to the third question is why does it never end with a sentence? Is that, well, we didn't give it any way to end with a sentence. We just told it, give me a sentence of 25 tokens, and whatever the 25th token is, at that point it's done. If you wanted a complete sentence, there is often in most tokenization schemes, there's a token called EOS for end of sentence, and you could keep generating tokens until you reach the first, the second, or the third end of sentence token and then quit there. Okay. All right. So let me take a little bit of an aside. I mean, this is going to start looking like an aside, but really it's kind of fundamental to what we need to talk about next. And I know that I've noticed in the Slack channel and a lot of the questions that you folks have been asking about is how do where do these choices come from? I mean, we exhibit these architectures and all these choices that we have to make, and how do we know what's right? Okay, well, I mean, the truth is that all these architectures are the result of a lot of trial and error and really a lot of failing until you get to something that works. Okay. So these things that look so sort of perfect and successful are really the result of trying a lot of stuff that didn't work. But that's not really a deep answer. The deeper answer is that in the end, these choices are dictated by what kind of data you're analyzing. And some strategies will be successful for some kinds of data and fail miserably with others. So Corey, who last week talked about applications of convolutional nets, which are based on these local convolutional kernels in image analysis. And convnets were this fantastic discovery, which arose because images have this local 2D spatial structure. And the architecture where you have, layers of convolutions followed by pooling, followed by layers of convolutions, followed by pooling, and so on. What that does is, the top layers of convolution give you the really small scale structure. They discover things like, slight gradients and so on, and on a few pixel scale. And as you pool those and keep going, you discover larger and larger scale structure in the image. And by the time this clever arrangement is done, what it's made is it's compiled a list of features in the image from the very, very small scales to across the entire image. Okay, so this works very well for this kind of data. But, if data doesn't have this kind of spatial structure, it'd be kind of senseless to use a convnet. I mean, sometimes people do it because people will try everything. But if you're modeling, say, the seasonal effects of product sales is the example that I chose here, a convnet would be a pretty bizarre choice to make. And in natural language sequences, it's also not really necessarily the first thing you should reach for, although, of course, these things have been tried. So when you're asking, how do we choose an architecture to analyze some data, it really makes sense to think about the nature of the data. And generally speaking, there are two kinds of data in this subject, okay, that have dominated deal practice. It's a little bit like the old joke about there being two kinds of people in the world. The people who divide people into two categories and the people who don't. But in the case of deep learning, it really is that by and large, there are only two types of data. It's vector data and sequential data. So far, the kinds of data that you've seen is vector data, but now as we move on to LLMs, we're going to have to talk more seriously about sequential data. So first, let's talk about what is the distinction between these data. So vector data is really very simple data. It's just fixed length lists of real values. That's it. So I have a bunch of lists of real values and they're all the same length. You can you're all accustomed to visualizing vectors in 3 dimensions. From there, it's not a huge extension to visualize a vector in higher dimensions. So one example here that I've shown here, for example, this is from SciPar 10. These are a few sample images. Image data can be thought of as vector data. An image with, say, a few thousand pixels and 3 colors as, say, maybe 10,000 real numbers. And you can visualize each image as a vector in a 10,000 dimensional space, say a 10,000 dimensional hypercube. Okay, so let's scroll down a little bit, please, Corey. Okay, with image data, what are the kinds of questions, the kind of queries, and the sorts of decisions that you'd like things to make? Well, of course, image classification. Everybody knows that one. Being able to tell a cat from an armadillo is one of the fundamental activities that we learn about in AI. A more subtle one, an interesting one, is inpainting, which is, suppose you have an image and it has a gap or a blur or something like that. Can you fill in that blank region? And segmentation is another valuable one. If I have an image with a bunch of different objects, maybe a person and a stop sign and a car and a cat, can I ask the architecture to put a little circle around each one of those and identify them correctly what they are? And you might imagine that would be a pretty important thing to do for a self-driving car, not, to correctly identify an object as, a person and not a fire hydrant or another car. Okay, so here's another set of examples. Data from simulations, also vectors. Okay, so on the left, we have a, weather or climate simulation. These are, a domain which is split up into cells, and in each cell we have pressures and temperatures and humidities and so on and so forth. Or, protein folding simulations, or cosmological structure simulations. All of these basically fall out as vectors. That you can represent all of these in exactly the same way as points in these very high dimensional vector spaces. And for this kind of data, the kind of typical queries and decisions you might ask, Corey, if you could scroll down just a wee bit, please. So manifold finding is fundamental to this. So you have this high dimensional space, but the data doesn't fill the space. The data is confined to some sub-region, usually a lower dimensional sub-region of the space. And that's important for dimensional reduction. You might want to know how many dimensions are really needed to describe this data, rather than the millions or hundreds of millions that were actually required, that were actually written to disk, okay? And relation. Some of these simulations are very expensive to compute, and you might want to learn from several of them to predict what what might be observed at a set of at a parameter setting where you haven't yet conducted a simulation. With an emulator that's much faster than the simulator. And there are other activities such as forecasting of weather, of economics, of pollution, and so on. Okay, so I think I've beaten vector data to death. So now let's talk about sequential data. So sequences are variable length lists. So here already we have a difference between vectors and sequences. A sequence can be any length. It can be 2, 3, 10, 100. I mean, it has to be a bounded length, but it can be, it's whatever it is, okay? The values of the sequences are not necessarily real. They can be real. They could be integers. They could be words. They could be weather states. They could be many other things. And possibly they could contain gaps, or possibly they may require for you to complete a sequence. So we just completed, asked GPT-2 to complete those sentences up there. So a few examples are things like text documents. And so this is a sequence of like fake Latin, the lorem ipsum. That's just an illustration. Don't bother to read that. But if you scroll down a little bit, you can see that the kind of queries that you think to ask of this kind of sequential data of text this is the natural language processing class of problems. So one famous one is, of course, translation. You get a passage in English, and the software has to translate it into German, say. Or spell checking and correction is, of course, very important. Nowadays, that's done much more efficiently than Clippy used to do it. Text prediction and generation, which is what we were doing earlier. And sentiment analysis, which is companies often would like to know automatically if someone writes a piece of text, if that text represents a lot of happy, warm, positive feeling, or neutral feeling, or a lot of sort of angry, ranting, negative feeling. So that kind of classification of text is also very important. Okay, so that's language modeling. But as I alluded to earlier, language isn't the only kind of sequential data that we care about. In fact, this course is called AI for Science. Language is nice, and if you're a linguist, language is science, but most of us are not linguists. And we're interested in other kinds of sequences. So here's a very famous one. This is the strand of RNA, okay? And you may know, or if not, I can, you now know at the level of cocktail party chit chat, that RNA is basically each 3 base pairs basically are called, they encode a codon, and a codon is a code unit along this chain. And multiple codons code for an amino acid. Amino acids are basically the constituents of proteins. So this sequence of codons is, in fact, a sequence, and you can imagine that there could be some important things that we could do with such sequences. So if Corey would scroll down a bit, the kinds of queries and decisions you want to make with this sort of data. Here's an important one. If suppose I had a bunch of COVID sequences, it might be interesting and useful and important to figure out which parts of the sequence are more prone to variation and mutation. This is actually something that you may remember Arvind Ramanathan gave a talk about his work. This is something that he's done precisely this with this kind of data. Or generating realistic DNA sequence, synthetic DNA, or predicting gene expression. Okay. Another example is a little up the chain from RNA. Once those enzymes come spitting out, then they basically join up together into excuse me, not enzymes. I said the wrong word. Once those amino acids come out, they join up into chains called proteins, and then the proteins do these super interesting things. First, they fold up, then they fold again, and these folds basically alter their chemical properties, their binding, and so on. So the kinds of questions that you want to ask from these sequences are, could we predict this folding structure? And could we predict the chemical and binding properties of such sequences? Okay, so scroll down a little more, please. So, there are many other examples. In fact, people are applying LLMs to everybody now, to everything. Chemical compounds, for example, which are sequences of atoms, weather states, which are sequences of spatially resolved temperatures, pressures, humidities, and so on. And so from this, I hope you get the impression that sequential data is really much, much richer and highly structured in general than vector data. And if you can learn to exploit that structure and exploit that richness, you can actually make some very interesting and nuanced decisions. Okay, so I put a break here, and so maybe we should take a break for, I don't know what the traditional break time is. Is it like 10 minutes? And during that time, why don't you go back to that GPT-2 model and try experimenting with try dabbling with the prompt a bit, and try dabbling with the length of the sequence, and see if there's something you can do to make see what you can discover about the kind of text that GPT-2 generates. See if by making a more complex prompt or a more informative prompt, you can actually restrain the madness, or maybe you want to try a crazy prompt and see what kind of crazy things it does. I mean, I think this will help sort of build intuition about the kind of mechanism by which these systems do text prediction, at least. Okay, so we're going to not exactly deep dive, but maybe shallow wade into some of the elements of sequence modeling for deep learning sequence modeling. And really, at this point, we're talking about the modern transformer architecture. I mean, transformers aren't the first attempt that's been made to model sequences. There are older efforts known as recurrent neural networks, RNNs, or things, variants thereon called long-term short-term memory, LSTM. And elements from those, including attention, were basically slapped together in a different sort of arrangement in order to create the modern transformer architecture. And there's something about that architecture that seems to be more powerful than the kinds of things that people did before, because, and you know this perfectly well because you probably messed around with ChatGPT, and you can tell that it can do these rather impressive parlor tricks. So, that didn't used to be possible. So we need to start talking about what are the, talking about LLMs, we need to start talking about the elements of LLMs. There are really three important elements and that require discussion. One is tokenization, one is word embedding, and the third one is attention. And I'm not going to discuss attention today. It's kind of a large topic, and I believe Archit is going to take it up when he picks things up next week. So let's start at tokenization. Okay, so you have to remember that because sequential data has this very free, can be valued rather freely, not necessarily reals, but in arbitrary values, you need to sort of standardize those values in some sense. They're used in, basically transformers. I mean, this is not completely true, but it's true to some extent. They kind of don't care what their data is. And the reason they don't care is that those elements in the sequence are generally translated into things called tokens. And tokens, as we saw already in the case of natural language processing, are either words or fragments of words chosen in a certain way. In the case of DNA, the tokens were, RNA, the tokens were codons, or they could be amino acids, and so on. Tokens basically have to be the property that they're elements of a fixed finite set, and we call that set the vocabulary, and it has a certain vocabulary size, which is a key parameter of the model. Okay. Now, in the case of English natural language, you may know that English is kind of an enormous language. It has about 500,000 words, and so if you did, tokenization in English words, that would be quite expressive of the structure of the English language, but it would have the unfortunate property of giving you this enormous vocabulary. So what people tend to do instead is that they choose tokenizations that are made up of, very common words, and then maybe subwords or word stems that they can use to make up less common words, and with a view to reducing the vocabulary size. And some, which we'll see in a moment, can reduce that 500,000 to as low as 30,000, which is quite a compression. Okay, I guess what I want to point out here is that these two objectives are in tension. I mean, you want your tokenization not to obscure the data. You want it to expose the structure in the sequences. But doing that in the most natural way might actually result in an unmanageable vocabulary size. So on the other hand, if you do a naive tokenization that gives you a small vocabulary size, it might be too hard to find that structure. So take an example, the chef added salt to the soup because it required seasoning, that phrase I wrote there. Now, there's an operation that we do in our minds that unconsciously, without realizing it, which the moment you start trying to think about parsing sentences you realize is a difficult problem to solve. The LLM needs to be able to parse this sentence and figure out that when the article "it" refers to the chef added salt to the soup. It required seasoning. It refers to the soup. It does not refer to the chef. Or to the salt, and so how it does this is basically through the attention mechanism that we're not going to talk about today. The reason I bring this up is that this relationship is easy to figure out if you start from a word tokenization, the chef and added. But if you had started with tokens that were individual letters, it might be a lot more difficult. It might take a lot more data to find this relationship statistically, okay, to find the relation, how to figure out what it refers to in a context like this. So this is the tension that has to be resolved. So now let's look at some examples of tokenization. So if you, Corey, would do the honors of running that cell. Let's look it over for a sec. I mean, what this thing is mostly is a definition of a function. What it does is this function takes, we've imported auto tokenizer from the transformers library. What this function does is it takes a tokenizer and a sequence that you give it, and it prints some basic statistics. One is it'll print a subset of the vocabulary. It'll print the vocabulary size. It'll print the tokens that it finds in the phrase that you give it, and similar things that we'll actually see in the example. So let's scroll down a bit. So here we've given it, so we've chosen the tokenizer. This is just the syntax for using this library. And the sequence that we've given it is, counselor, please adjust your zoom filter to appear as a human rather than as a cat, which I think is one of the greatest phrases in American legal history. And you can probably find it in the news. And then you run the summary on the tokenizer and this particular sequence, and what it finds is, so it gives you examples of the vocabulary. You can see that there's some funny stuff going on. Among other things, there's some whole words, there's some word fragments. A lot of these words appear to start with a G for some reason that we'll get to in a moment. Then the next line is it gives you a list of the tokens that it actually found in our phrase. And you see that a lot of them start with this Unicode G in front, and then it gives you the token IDs, and then it decodes it, okay? So what's going on here? This is not a naive word encoding. This is a clever encoding called byte pair encoding. And what it does is what a lot of these things do. It's not something that you do a priori. You don't decide in advance how this thing is going to tokenize. Instead, what these strategies do is they take a large body of text and they basically break it up into small elements, and they start joining these elements together in a clever way designed to make very common words into their own tokens, and then provide enough token fragments that you can actually build up the vocabulary of rare words. And this is how they get the vocabulary down to, I think this one was 50,000. So that initial G represents, one of the efficiencies that byte pair encoding does is that if a word is preceded by a white space, which is any space, then it uses that character to signify that the word is not the same word. It's a word preceded by the white space. And this is just sort of inside baseball for how this tokenization achieves its pretty impressive compression results. I mean, a factor of 10, really. And if you want to see in more detail how byte pair encoding works, you should click on that link. And if you want to look at the library, just type help tokenizer. I think, tokenizer 1 to see the doc string from that thing, which is something you should always do in Python, if for fun and profit. Okay, so now let's take a different tokenizer. This one is from the pre-trained model BERT, and it uses a different tokenization scheme called word piece. Okay, so we're going to give it the same sequence, and here's a sample of the vocabulary, the full vocabulary that it has, and you can see that a lot of the things that it finds are whole words, but there's this odd thing. It looks like it found a word fragment, and it denotes word fragments with that double hash mark. And so here's the tokenization of our sentence. It split counselor into counsel and or, and it split Zoom into zoo and M, presumably because there's it found a lot of zoos that it can represent, and it can just add an M to those. Okay, so that's what it does. And then, you tokenize the sequence and then rebuild it. And of course, the same sequence comes back. Okay, so this is just another clever strategy, which you do it's a different algorithm, but you do as the same sort of thing. You take a large corpus of data, and instead of choosing your tokenization a priori, you let the data teach you what an efficient tokenization is. Okay. And those double hashes are basically just connote word fragments. Okay, you could have, and this will be an example of this in the homework. You could just use elementary Python string operations to split sentences into words and to punctuation and so on. If you did that, you get a very large vocabulary size. In English, you get about 500,000 tokens, give or take a few. But they wouldn't require training on large corpuses in advance. In NLP, nobody does this. The effort of training your tokenizer in advance is well worth the trouble, because that reduction in the case of a word piece down to 30,000 is really makes a lot easier the job of the large language model. Okay, that's tokenizing. Let's move on to token embedding. So, okay, I'm not sure whether one-hot encoding has been discussed in this class. You could imagine when you get a token to encode it in the following way. I take a vector the length of the entire vocabulary, and I put zeros almost everywhere, and a 1 in the location where that token occurs. Okay. That is an encoding, but it's very inefficient, and it's in a vector space that's the size of the vocabulary. And even with these clever tokenizations, you can see that dealing with a 30,000 dimensional vector space, especially when most of the components are filled with zeros, is not necessarily the most natural or useful thing to do. What people do, but on the other hand, people here, people in who work with LLMs like to work with vector spaces. They don't really like to work directly with sequences. And so what they do is what's called an embedding. They choose a vector space of a much lower dimension, often, 1024, and they try to find a map called a token embedding from each token to a region of this space. Now, in principle, this embedding can, you have to be careful. You can imagine that embedding something that's 30,000 long down to a space that's 1,000 long could be a lossy process, and that is a danger that you could have information loss. Well, people tend to try to guard against that by choosing the embedding in such a way that tokens that kind of look alike or belong alike land in the same region of the space, and tokens that look and different groups of tokens that look different from each other try to land in different regions of the space. And there are other tricks that are important having to do with the encoding of sequence location that I believe Archit intends to talk a little bit more about next week. It's a complex task, but the bottom line is when you're done with token embedding, now you have this moderate size dimension. I mean, 1,000 dimensions is less than the dimensions of those CIFAR 10 images that I showed you a sample of above there. And now you have a data structure, a vector, that's kind of easy to manipulate, easy to subject to attention mechanisms, which are the things that really make these things work, which is why people do this, okay? It's to allow the computational architecture to operate on familiar and easy tensorizable data entities. And that's, probably a good reason to do this, because sequences as they stand aren't easy to embed in tensors. So let's take a look at the visualization of the token embedding. This can be done. I adapted, there's this professor named Kevin Gimple at UChicago's Toyota Tech Institute. And he provided these visualizations that will actually show in two-dimension representation of this 1,024 dimensional representation from the BERT model. So let's see, have you already executed this cell? I see, moved everything to CUDA. That's probably a good thing to do. Okay, so, well, this is basically going to get the word, basically create the word embeddings or extract the word embeddings and print the original vocabulary size. Oh, well, something bad happened here. I did not see that message long enough. Probably the CUDA thing. Okay, good. Thank you. Thank you for that good rapid debugging. So what this is printing is, so here's the word embedding, and it's giving you the shape. The embedding is a two-dimensional array. The first dimension is the vocabulary size, and the second dimension is the dimension of the embedding space. So what this BERT word ems gives you is basically a mapping from each point of the vocabulary to a point in this vector space. Okay. Right. So now we're going to visualize this data now. There's this visualization technique called t-SNE, which, if you care to know, it means T-distributed stochastic neighbor embedding. And again, it tries to do what embeddings do, which is to say, place, instead of take this 1,000-dimensional embedding, project it down to 2 dimensions, but try to preserve the property that things that belong together fall in the similar regions, and things that belong apart are well separated. So t-SNE takes a while to compute, and I've been babbling on here while it's been going, but it should do, I believe, 2,500 iterations. So has it, let's see, yeah, cue theme from Jeopardy, but I think we're done. Okay, and yeah, and we did a bit of matplotlib visualization, and this is the word cloud that emerges from this. And of course, you can't see what's going on here because the words are too small, but so take it from me. Now we're about to zoom in a little bit, but these are, in fact, this is a cloud of words. And now, as we go down to some of the zooms that are static images in this, if you could scroll down a little bit, Here's a zoom in from a region that appears to show clusters of verbs with similar meaning. So you see a cluster. So this is actually a blow up of a small region in that picture. Okay, so you can see pick, picked, selection, selected, chose. Those are obviously words that belong, that statistically fall in the same context, and therefore the model decided they believe together, as with thought, thinking, think, believed, believe, representing, represent. I mean, those things that have the same word stem are kind of easy, but it found and discovered, are the same, are similar. Realized, understanding, and so on. So it's actually successfully, according to this representation, figuring out good clusters of meaning, or at least of common meaning, and separating them from clusters with other meanings. And that's a very reassuring property. So now we zoom in another region of that diagram, and here we see some cluster. Remember, BERT connotes with a double hash word fragments in its tokenization scheme. This particular cluster appears to be English suffixes. So isation, shun, ant, yawn, and so on. These are things that these are common clusters that are used to as suffixes to ordinary English words. So that's kind of interesting. It decided that these clusters are more similar to each other than other kinds of word fragments that it used. Not all the word fragments have this property of being suffixes. Some of them, remember earlier it found it terminated counsel, it made counselor by terminating counsel with or, and or is definitely not a word suffix. So let's go on and look to the last one. Okay, this is another interesting. These are also word fragments, but this is a cluster of word fragments that appear to be parts of the ends of names of jurisdictions. So you can see things like land could be England, or burg could be Schaumburg, or ville could be Naperville. You can kind of see the pattern here. It's kind of, this is another interesting discovery that after training the model, all of this happens after training, you understand. It didn't start out, this knowledge didn't spring, it wasn't put it by hand, and it isn't accidental. It's after many, many, many rounds of training, it moves these word embeddings around in space until they find themselves in these clusters with their brethren and far away from the other tribes of tokens. Okay, so that's pretty much it for today. So let's talk quickly just about the homework. So there's a Jupyter Notebook homework1.ipnb, which is in the same directory as this notebook. And it basically asks you to do the thing that I told you nobody does in NLP, which is write a generic Python tokenizer in that notebook. So I started it up with an example that works, but doesn't work very well because it does some undesirable things. And so the homework assignment is to fix it according to the guidance provided in that homework. And then the second homework item is embedding. Go back to that, the Matplotlib code that made that word cloud at the top. This code right here. And, zoom in, make it zoom in a few places and see if you can find another interesting cluster, identify that cluster and say what that cluster is, okay? There are lots of clusters in here. It shouldn't be too hard to find some that have some interesting properties. Okay, I think that's it, and we are out.
So one question from Slack I saw show up, Carlo, is Fathia asked, do words appear more than once in the cloud? Some words fit into more than one meaning, right?
Well, so it's an excellent question. I'm not actually sure. It's possible that synonyms might appear more than once, and it could be, although probably not, because I don't think they get double token. I mean, that would be a function of the tokenizer. The tokenizer would have to recognize the different token contexts and create two separate tokens for the same word. And I don't believe that the tokenizers do that. Doing that is the job of the LLM. And so it just, those kinds of cases, synonyms make LLMs work a little bit harder, but that's why they're, people are so impressed with them, is because they appear to be capable of distinguishing the same token, the synonym meanings of the same token in different contexts.
Excellent, thank you. Okay, so looking at the time, thank you so much, Carlo, for introducing all of this. We're gonna now shift gears to our science talk. So I would like to introduce Troy Arcomano. And as Troy gets set up, I'll introduce him a little bit. So Troy is a postdoctoral fellow at Argonne National Lab, working on machine learning applications for weather and climate in the environmental sciences division. During his time at Argonne, he has been the Argonne lead for several projects, including a large collaboration to create a state-of-the-art foundation model for weather prediction. He received his Ph.D. at Texas A&M, where he worked on developing machine learning applications for weather forecasting and investigating how machine learning could be used to improve climate models. So today, Troy is going to be talking about what we see on the screen, specifically the AI revolution for weather and climate. So Troy, take it away.
Thank you for that lovely introduction. And it seems that this talk is very appropriate because I will be talking a lot about transformers and how they have been used to help this AI revolution for weather and climate. So I'll just start with a little background for those who are not familiar with how weather forecasting is. So weather forecasting, even though most people just look at their weather app, there is a huge multi-billion-dollar enterprise that sits behind each one of those weather apps, whether it's Weather Channel or Apple Weather. There's a large social and economical impacts to weather, with billions of dollars lost to hurricanes and droughts each year, as well as many unfortunate lives that have been lost to extreme weather. So it's very important to be able to predict when these extreme events are going to be happening. And really, this is a kind of a culmination of 40 years of research that has led us to how weather forecasting is done today. Specifically, how we do it today is using physics-based numerical models. So we take the governing equations for fluids on a rotating sphere, which is essentially what the atmosphere is, and we then discretize them and then fill in the gaps for things like thermodynamics and stuff. This has been a very long and arduous process over, as I mentioned, 40 years, with slow and incremental but steady progress with advancements in numerical methods, which has kind of led to what has been dubbed the quiet revolution in numerical weather prediction. Essentially, now it's about 1 day of forecast skill per decade of research, with large investments with many teams across the globe. This is a global collaboration to improve weather forecasting. So when I mean 1 day of forecast skill per decade, this essentially means a 5-day forecast 10 years from ago is the same as a 6-day forecast now. So you can imagine this has been a very slow progress, but it has been really a monumental miracle almost with the advent of modern weather forecasting, where we can successfully predict extreme weather events like hurricanes and flash flooding 8 days into the future in some cases. But AI has really changed a lot of this. So this quiet revolution has become actually quite loud over the last 5 years. With advancements in machine learning architectures like transformers, the availability of hardware, such as machines that we host at ALCF, as well as large quality data, and the ability to scale to these large data, which is a lot of it's come from large language modeling and has moved to other fields, as well as financial motivations, has really set the stage for a paradigm shift in weather forecasting. What took 40 years to get us here has really took machine learning and private companies about 5 years. So 5 years ago, machine learning was just first starting to be used for weather modeling, and they were quite unsuccessful with skill that was really as good as the 1980 models. And then in just 5 short years, we are now at the point where machine learning-based models are as accurate or even more accurate than NWP. So we've compressed about 40 years of research into 5 years using machine learning, and that does not seem like it's slowing down. And these models have been successfully demonstrated in operational settings. So even as we speak today with severe weather going on in Chicago, weather forecasters are now starting to use these data-driven weather forecasting models to make decisions. And the really nice thing about these models is what used to take a warehouse-sized CPU machine can now be done on a single GPU in seconds. So it really has revolutionized the field of weather. And just to give you a sense of what this actually looks like. So these are 4 different forecasts of a hurricane that was going to be making landfall 5 days into the future. So if you were a decision maker or a weather forecaster, you would have these models available to you, and you would have to tell local emergency response and people like the fire department and mayors to make evacuations and stuff if you were living along the East Coast. And now 3 of these models are actually machine learning, and one of these is the best numerical based model. And I would love for you to take a look, ponder which one is a machine learning model, which one's the numerical based model. I promise you, it's really hard to tell which one is which, but I'll just advance in the. So we have 3 machine learning models that are from private companies, as I mentioned. So the lower right, or at least on my side, is the best traditional numerical weather prediction model, predicting a hurricane that's going to miss the East Coast, while we have 3 other models that are wildly different in terms of the machine learning architecture. We have on the top left a Fourier neural operator model that was trained at NVIDIA that was predicting a hurricane that would also miss the East Coast. We have a graphic neural network from Google DeepMind that was that actually had better forecast skill for this particular hurricane than the best traditional model. And then we have a vision transformer that is also with very high skill. So it really is a monumental shift with what's going on with weather forecasting. There's been a lot of other machine learning applications, not just pure weather prediction, such as the time series of the weather. These are traditionally been dubbed data-driven methods. This is kind of the 2 camps that have evolved. These are completely independent of the physics-based models, while there's been hybrid models that combine machine learning with existing models to improve them. There's been operational products. As I mentioned, we're looking at severe weather today in Chicago. These operational products, such as NATOcast, are being used by decision makers as we speak to predict whether or not there should be tornado watches and warnings for the Chicago area. So machine learning has really penetrated the atmospheric science community greatly over the last few years. And basically anything that you can think of in atmospheric science has been, or at least being investigated to be used with machine learning. I'll just talk a little bit about, in the last half of this talk, on what we at Argonne have been looking at, specifically the data-driven approach. The task that we want to do is take a snapshot of the 3-dimensional atmosphere and predict the weather over the globe for the next 14 days. This is a monumental task. We're talking about millions of variables that need to be predicted in high resolution, both in the horizontal and temporal. To start off, we start with a very high quality data set. These are the same data sets that these private companies have been utilizing, specifically using observation-based reanalysis. So this is the best guess of the atmosphere, specifically ERA5 for those who are interested. Working with this data set can be actually a very large challenge from a computer science and machine learning engineering perspective. These images are much larger than what we typically look at. We're talking about a 721 by 1440 image. And instead of just having 3 channels for red, green, and blue, if you're doing image classification, we have hundreds, if not thousands of channels, each one representing a 2-dimensional field, such as the temperature at the surface, as well as the temperature that spans from 1 mile all the way up to the top of the atmosphere. So integrating this data set and adapting the software and hardware needed to train on this data set has come up with a lot of interesting and novel approaches, such as complicated loss functions and taking a traditional vision transformer or VIT and giving it an image translation instead of an image classification task. And here I'll just talk a little bit about how we developed a weather-specific VIT to predict the weather. Just to give an example of what this actually looks like in practice, once this is trained, we basically input this globe, this image of a globe and into our VIT, and imagine instead of just looking at one specific variable like we are here, you have a stack of these globes that span hundreds of different variables. Those get inputted into our machine learning, and then we want to look at the 5-day forecast, and this is what the machine learning in the center outputs. And here we're looking at a large extreme event over the Northern Pacific, and then we actually verify this with ground truth, and we see that the machine learning model is actually doing very well, successfully predicting this extreme weather event that otherwise would have not been able to be predicted without machine learning. The best traditional methods actually miss an event like this at this time scale. So how we took a vanilla vision transformer and adapted it to weather specifically, we had to really reduce the complexity of the model. So a traditional vision transformer, and it sounds like we were talking about that before I started talking, things like tokenization and stuff. those are going to scale in a normal VIT by the number of channels. So you could quickly imagine, as I mentioned, with thousands of different channels, we would blow up the GPU memory quite quickly. So we do the normal variable tokenization, but then we go through this multi-cross attention layer where we do this variable aggregation. This way, the vision transformer doesn't scale by the number of channels. So, we can fit a very large model onto a GPU. And then we take that, after we go through that cross attention, we have a large embedded layer where we then do time embedding and positioning embedding, and then they move into a normal transformer block. And then we output the images, so the target lead times and the variables. So what we call in the business unpatchify this. We have the last transformer block, and that's basically utilized to unpatchify everything, and then we get our two-dimensional images like we wanted. We also looked at what's going on in the state-of-the-art vision transformer. So the adaptive layer normalization, and the dyno backbone for a lot of these vision transformers has actually, we see appreciable gain by using this. As I mentioned, the variable aggregation and tokenization really helps scale this model so that we can input more channels. Typically, the more channels you put into this, well, because there's a large correlation between variables, the better your model performs. In terms of how we actually get a 14-day forecast, it's very difficult. You can do a direct forecast. So you have the atmosphere's X day now, and then you want to predict 14 days into the future. You can train a bunch of models to basically fill in the gaps between now and 14, but that's quite costly to train because you have a number of models. A continuous model is quite difficult because of just how many variables would need to be forecasted. So what we do is an autoregressive or an iterative forecast. So we train the model to predict 6 hours into the future, and then we feed that back into the machine learning model, and then forecast into the future. In terms of how we actually train this, this was done on Polaris. We used 126 GPUs, and each one of the steps, so there's a 2-step training that I won't have time to go into, took roughly 24 hours. So it's kind of interesting. And when you actually do all of this training, here we look at the performance over hundreds of different forecasts over out of sample data. We see Stormer, which is the model that we developed, in the green curve, and it actually outperforms the other models that I've mentioned earlier, things like Pangu Weather and GraphCast, which are other machine learning models, as well as the best traditional numerical-based models, such as the IFS high resolution. And we're actually seeing performance that is even coming onto numerical-based ensemble methods. So root mean squared error, so the lower the better. And we can see, especially in the longer time frame, the machine learning is actually performing quite a bit better than traditional methods and other machine learning models. And just to draw some conclusions, with the advent of these scalable machine learning architectures, such as vision transformers and graph neural networks, coupled with a vast amount of high quality data and access to large GPU machines, this has led to a complete paradigm shift in weather forecasting. I didn't get time to mention it, but climate modeling may undergo a very similar paradigm shift, where climate modeling has traditionally been done by the government and DOE labs. They may soon be done by private companies. And for those who are interested in trying to tackle these really at the edge problems, weather is actually a great test bed for newly developed machine learning architectures. There's large, high quality data on the order of petabytes. And as I mentioned, with the large number of channels and very large image sizes and a very difficult task, this actually pushes the limit to what current hardware and software can do. And with that, I'll take any questions. Hopefully I'm on time.
Yes, we do have time, and we also have questions. So Alfred asked, we have a Slack channel that all of the participants are engaging on. And Alfred asked in the Slack channel, does physics play a role in any of the data-driven weather forecasting?
So people have investigated like physics-informed neural networks, and people do try to change or tailor their architecture. So like in the case with a graphic neural network, the underlying mesh, so how the edges and stuff communicate with each other, they have done that with a projection on a sphere because we know the Earth is a sphere. Those seem to help a little bit, but if you actually do a lot of ablation studies, trying to come up with like weather specific or Earth specific things actually really doesn't help. It just seems that using a vanilla VIT that can scale does just as well or even better. That was actually some of the point of our research. So right now, the physics has not played a role. That may change into the future, especially now that more people are, and this is a very competitive field, but for now it's not.
Excellent. Howie asked, and I think you addressed this a little bit, but more detail. What metrics do you use to evaluate if the predictions are good? They specifically said, like, do you compare the local temperature with something like the RMSE?
Yeah, so we do, so we look at each variable. So imagine each channel is a different variable, things like the temperature. So in this case, 2-meter temperature, which is what is measured at weather stations. We compare that to all of the other models, such as Pangu, which is a weather model, GraphCast, which is a data-driven model as well, and then the IFS, which is a numerical model. And we just look at things like root mean squared error, as well as anomaly correlations. New models have become probabilistic, so there's a lot of metrics to compare, but that's really just a new emerging field. So like ranked histograms and other probabilistic metrics come into play then.
Another question from Howie is, does climate modeling use things like ensemble modeling to assess uncertainty?
Yes, so that is really where this whole field is heading, is ensembling. Unfortunately, the traditional methods are very expensive to run, so they need very large machines to even run one simulation into the future for climate. But with the advent of these machine learning models that do well for forecasting, we're going to see that if it's successful for climate modeling, we're going to run many more ensembles with different scenarios. So how governments change policy and stuff, we're going to be able to use these data-driven models to better assess the uncertainty and stuff. So ensemble modeling is huge for this field.
Currently, so you compared 4 different models that had been done, 3 that were ML, 1 that was more traditional. Do you know at this point, like, how decision makers or other people sort of assess these models? And like, if you have 4, how do you decide which one to sort of go with?
Yes, so that is a very interesting operational question. So a lot of the time with these machine learning, with these private companies, they'll just make this model available and they won't talk with decision makers and stuff. And that's kind of where us as domain scientists come in. So we've been on the ground asking operational forecasters, the people who are issuing your weather statements, what they want, and things like having ensembles, like very large number of ensembles that are currently not possible, or things that they're interested in. And we're going to, in the future, tailor our research to better address the deficiencies that they currently have for weather forecasting.
Excellent, thank you. I think one last question, I guess, coming from me is, a lot of this is currently coming from like private companies. You mentioned NVIDIA, Google. Do you know sort of what kind of challenges arise from that, having something come from a private company versus the US government or some country's government?
Yes, so this is like the paradigm shift. We don't, especially for weather forecasting, there's licensing issues and stuff. So ECMWF, or the European Center for Medium Range Weather Forecasting, is the world's largest weather forecasting system. You have to pay to get their data, but now they're running these they've paid or collaborated with private companies to make these models, such as Pangu and GraphCast, and they have to give away the data for free. So that's how I'm able to get this first picture, because you actually have to pay to get these images. But luckily the other 3 are free now because of licensing confliction and stuff. So it's a completely different way that's going forward. And I think, our government and stuff is going to have to figure that out quite soon.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Troy.